Thank you very much indeed. I mentioned last night that I was talking last night essentially about mercy in the life of an individual, lived experience of an individual person. And I was talking about some of the themes. I'll recap those in a moment. And today I want to try to talk a little bit about mercy as a public value, but I will get to that. It's a letter written by Vincent van Gogh that I think provides me with my starting point for this second consideration of mercy as a Christian contribution to contemporary society. Vincent van Gogh wrote to his friend, "I want to paint man and woman with that something of the eternal which the halo used to symbolise, but which we now seek to confer through the actual radiance of our colour vibrations. Just as, for the most part, contemporary artists have left halos behind as a way of expressing the divine presence in relation to humanity, so reflective Christians respect the theological equivalent of halos, pre-modern expressions of doctrine and belief, but must always look for ways to express the mysterious presence of God for a post-Enlightenment society in new and imaginative ways, expressing eternal truths in new ways. Just as some people might ask why we still paint landscapes when we have photography, Christian faith wants to ask questions not just about what is seen, but about the quality of seeing, and explore the assertion that we ourselves are seen by the unseen God. And this search for what might replace the theological equivalent of halos is acute in the search for how to teach, embody, encourage, and deepen our collective appreciation of mercy. In the last lecture, as you've heard, I mentioned Jerry Hughes's good old Uncle George, and I suggested that in some ways the church has replaced him with great aunt Oprah. Both images are damaging to us, and both have trouble incorporating a scripturally faithful concept of mercy. Because in a society where most people live their lives without reference to organised religion, I do meet people, a lot, of every generation and background, who still want to find a way to ask, is there a God, really? And if so, what is that God like? But the truth is that they don't often really want to ask a church person, especially not in a dog collar, in case we start describing the theological equivalent of a halo, a nice enough floaty symbol above our heads that everybody knows is not really there. And although I hope that it's obvious by now, I do want to say that underpinning these thoughts of mine is the conviction that as soon as I or anyone else even starts to try to speak about God, or even use the word God, really, then we're lost. Because immediately, as the philosophers will tell us, that reifies God, makes God into a thing over there that I can believe in or not, rather than carrying a sense that if there is a God, then that God is the very essence of living, in which we live and move and have our being. But, bless us, human beings, we won't stop trying to talk about it, remembering all the time that we're lost in the attempt. So I do find that people want to talk about God, but sometimes they don't really want to talk about that in church or to the church. And this is one way that the church is in danger of ceding public space and bowing out of what could be a really creative conversation. Many people are quite clear about a God they don't believe in. I hear them saying it, often a bit defensively. Well, I don't believe in a man on a throne. Well, I don't believe in a beardy, pointy man. I don't believe in a God that shouts at me. Well, I don't believe in a God that lets earthquakes happen. These gods we don't believe in are often fueled by a confusion or reluctance to work away at an understanding of divine, kenotic, self-emptying power that makes God's judgment mercy in itself. In the first lecture, I looked briefly at some of the impediments that I thought existed, theologically and psychologically, in today's world to even speaking about mercy, a merciful God, or a merciful life. that a consideration of mercy made us face ourselves in ways we're often uncomfortable with, as people who have agency, as people who are perpetrators as well as victims, and as people who are, because of those things, needy. When expressed in liturgy collectively, these combinations can ossify our spiritual identities into that of our fear of ourselves as a permanently powerful perpetrator, only ever addressing God from the floor, expecting the boot on our neck at any moment. In this context, we can become grimly grateful for being saved from our fate and think that being told off in church is the most that we can expect or deserve. Or rather than grimly grateful, we can also become permanently, rather hysterically grateful, too quick to applaud God's favour towards us. One of the key sources for a Christian consideration of mercy is, of course, the parables of Jesus. Short plays, sharply drawn characters, stories told to, as the Greek would have it, paraballo, run alongside life, as it is actually lived. Stories that wrong-foot us and discomfort us. The subject of mercy in the parables of Jesus is a recurring theme. The one I'm thinking of now is a trap, a brilliant trap that works exquisitely even today. And Jesus' audience, or so Luke is careful to tell us, is an audience that, as he puts it, trusted in themselves to get things right, and also an audience who regarded other people with contempt. You might know the story. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other, for all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus sets it up. There are two men. There are very often two men. Sometimes brothers, but in this case not related. They go to the temple to pray. One of them is an observant religious man. He stands by himself, a potent symbol of autonomy and free will. And he prays fervently to God, thank God I'm not like other people. The other man is one of those hated collaborators with the occupation, a tax agent. He won't even look up, but says, God, be merciful to me. We listen to this story, even today. We listen to the motto at the end, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And we nod, and we think to ourselves, well, thank God I'm not like that Pharisee. The trap works, even today. One Jewish commentator puts it brilliantly. If you're not discomfited by one of Jesus' parables, then you just haven't been listening properly. I've heard many sermons on the parable of the Good Samaritan, explaining that the Samaritan is of a despised and rejected class of people, and so it is the rejected ones who Jesus is holding up to be the example for all as one who shows mercy. But rather, in the context of the time, it's more of an enmity than a rejection. Is it much safer to think that it's one of society's outsiders who is the example, rather than, as the same Jewish commentator puts it, because of the violence and attrition between Jews and Samaritans, perhaps it's more about enemies? Maybe Jesus is saying that the one who wants to kill you is in the end the one who can save you. A more challenging definition of mercy and our need for it from our opponents. I used to live in a large community with adults with learning disabilities, where acting out the gospel parables was a regular thing. It still is. The story is told in L'Arche of the parable of the Good Samaritan being acted out, and the young woman who happened to have Down syndrome, playing the Samaritan as rehearsed, tended to the wounds of the beaten-up man by the roadside by washing his face gently. She then delivered the man to the innkeeper as rehearsed, and while she was there, she tenderly washed the face of the innkeeper too. Then she went and found the priest and the Levite by this stage behind the curtain, and she washed their faces too. Finally, she went to the robbers, cowering behind their rock, and she washed their faces too. The mercy and love taught by Jesus was given new life in the wordless sermon of that young woman. If we haven't been discomforted by a parable, then we haven't read it properly. And nowhere is that more the case than in Jesus' teaching about mercy. The theologian Tim Gorringe has said that Scripture is not of itself countercultural, but daily encounter with it will make us so. The Church's spiritual practice of reciting psalms every day and reading Scripture in public is a way in and of itself of the Church nurturing its prophetic energy and honing its character as a bringer of good, if challenging, news to its contemporary context, whatever and wherever that is. I want to try to reach for ways to talk about a wider consideration of mercy in our culture and church in this lecture, and I want to find a way into this with a consideration of the relationship between the operation of mercy and the passage of time. We saw in the first lecture, in William Blake's reflection, that time is the mercy of eternity. I wonder if a way into this might be some reflection on our own culture's attitude towards time. It's been said that watching the news in order to understand life in the world is like trying to tell the time by looking at the second hand on a clock. It's accurate, but exhausting, and we have no real perspective. This might be more true this week, even today, than at any time in the past. By contrast, the operation of divine mercy could be said to be like telling the time by looking at the hour hand on a clock. No less accurate, no less contemporary, no less now, but living by a different rhythm and progressing at a different speed. Another way of putting this is that a deliberately hectic and diversionary culture, say, means that we can develop a kind of presenteeism, especially online. We half read one article, we follow a link to the tweet, we look up the person who tweeted, we read their other tweets, we follow a link to a chapter of their book in which we find a link to another article, and in no time we've disappeared down an internet rabbit hole. And we devour time and experience as consumers, which might make this culture of hurry and perpetual movement something closer to greed. And we're never sated. In Jesus' parables, there's often a consideration of timeliness. The landlord is away for a while and then returns. The farmer leaves the wheat in with the tares for a while, doesn't rip them out immediately. In that particular parable in Matthew's Gospel, the instinct of the servant is to clear the space, but the master, knowing this will destroy the wheat, allows them to grow together until harvest. In the parable of the ungrateful servant, the fellow pleads, "Give me time," which the master does give, and then he in turn doesn't give to the fellow servant. The master wants to cut down the unproductive tree. This time it's the servant who urges it be given one more year, and the master agrees. It's not only in the parables that the timeliness of mercy and love is evident. The restoration of one man's sight is gradual. He sees trees before he sees clearly. There's sometimes a gradualness that's needed for the operation of mercy to be effective, and a deeper trajectory throughout Jesus' life towards the timeliness of fulfillment, the telos, the moment on the cross when Christ is heard to say, "It is fulfilled." I'm not just talking about busyness and a busy society. It does seem that in a mature capitalist society interested in maximising outcome for minimal effort, there is a possibility that mercy as a value and a mechanism is moving further out of our reach as a society that values speed over timeliness. I wonder what you think about that. One of the signs that you are powerful in our society is that you never have to wait. This is an area where a Christian consideration of time and timeliness could be a distinctive contribution, perhaps by developing what we might call a decisive patience. And the context for that will be eternity. What I mean by that is very obvious but not often appreciated truth, that if eternity is, well, eternal, then it doesn't start sometime in the future, like when we're dead, for example. It is the element in which we live now. Of course, it's obvious. To borrow a picture from William Blake once again, his engraving of the judgment described by Jesus in Matthew's Gospel is inventive and startling. The movement between judgment and mercy isn't linear but circular. God's judgment is not so much focused on a future moment, but is an endless eternal opportunity for change and renewal in the eternal present. As one of Blake's interpreters puts it, the moment of opportunity for the overcoming of selfhood, which is not some future penalty, but a present cathartic possibility. It's nothing less than a process of renewal now. The true new covenant is based in mercy and forgiveness. Blake's engraving of the Last Judgment shows a circular reality that I think he's trying to tell us is always true, of sheep and goats passing by the Son of Man, who judges all mercifully and justly, of course, but that sheepness and goatness is within each human being, and that this is being judged mercifully by God constantly. As Blake put in words too, and throughout all eternity, I forgive you and you forgive me. As our dear Redeemer said, this the wine and this the bread. This eternal perspective and timeliness saves our consideration of mercy from being something we do to make ourselves good. Mercy becomes not primarily about ethics, but eschatology. And that speaks to the very nature of the church itself, whenever it's trying to speak more broadly. Johann Baptist Metz has written a political theology of mercy, in which he states that the church is primarily not a moral institution, but a bearer of hope. Its theology is not primarily an ethic, but an eschatology. Mercy is an apocalyptic reality of God towards which we are living. But bearing in mind the thought that I started with right at the beginning of yesterday's lecture, that theology can get too abstract very easily, and that mercy might be particularly susceptible to this, it's important to say at the same time that the operation of mercy, so challenging as it is in our lived experience, will never allow us to over-spiritualize what must be an element of salvation in the flesh, as we live it, fundamental to an incarnational religion. This future-orientated theological and spiritual and liturgical trajectory is one I want to say a little bit more about later. But for now, in the wisdom of the theologian Walter Wink, the relationship between the operation of mercy and hope might be expressed in his assertion that hope imagines its future and then acts as if that future is irresistible. And while I'm reflecting on the eternal quality of mercy, it's also pastorally important to restate that we learn from the Scriptures that there are some things that are not resolved in mercy this side of death. I learn that from the mercy shown to Peter by Jesus over breakfast on the shores of Galilee. I learn that sometimes the home of some mercy is the other side of death, not in this life. It's not within the temporal relationship between them that Peter receives the mercy of Jesus, but after the torturous execution has taken its course and after the resurrection hope has been realised. Then Peter receives the mercy of God in Christ, the undeserved, perhaps, restoration that requires him to declare his love as often as he denied him. I want to pause here for a moment just to comment on one aspect of the operation of mercy that's really important in the lived experience of pastoral ministry. Just as the previous point, that some things are not resolved this side of death. Just a few weeks ago, a woman came to me to ask on behalf of her friend who attends another church whether she should forgive her husband who beats her and stay with him. It's one area, domestic violence, where I've often found that it's really mattered that women are priests who can interpret and teach the injunction to show mercy or forgiveness within the context of a gendered experience of both faith and life. This very question illustrates the dangerous waters that a consideration of mercy takes us into. But it also differentiates it from the ethical teaching to forgive, which her friend had imbibed from childhood and was trapped by now. I was able to talk about power imbalance between her friend and her husband, and for that to be the basis for a Christian consideration of sin and forgiveness. And frankly, to be able to say with complete confidence that being a Christian woman did not ever mean that you had to be a doormat or a punch bag. The point I'm alluding to here is to say that from a position of historic exclusion, which includes, as far as, for example, the church institution is concerned, people of colour, women, people who identify as LGBTQ, people who are impaired physically or who have learning difficulties, and many others. For these groups, it's just not enough to preach that the Christian injunction is to forgive or show mercy to one another. Without a proper consideration of the power imbalances, it's damaging. Famously, Jean Robinson remarked that in the fractious and painful discussions in the Episcopal Church about sexuality, it was important to remember that the contributions from different groups was analogous to the contributions made to a cooked breakfast by a chicken and a pig. The stakes were very different, depending on who you were. Similarly, if the paradigm for pastoral ministry is Jesus kneeling at the feet of his friends to wash their feet, for groups who historically, habitually have been made to kneel and serve others, women for example, then the path to salvation is different. For them, it's important to learn to stand, like the woman bent double in the Gospels, before choosing to follow the example of Christ and kneel and serve. This humility, this forgiveness, this act of mercy is then freely chosen. The agency of the person doing it is retained. In this way, it is what we might call a redeemed mercy, not a teaching about mercy weaponized to keep certain groups in their place. Back to the consideration of that operation of mercy and the movement of time. Again, Metz comments that in the domination of a Western rationality in determining the rate of progress, particularly industrially, it's important to recognise that European culture and economy has changed more rapidly in the last 150 years than in the previous 2000. He reflects now on the society and economy of Brazil, whose president has been in the news recently over the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. Reflecting on Brazil in particular, he identifies that the acceleration of modernisation has been matched only by a growing impoverishment. In a brilliantly clear description, he comments, "The development has had no time to develop. It destroys the time of human beings who seem to be crushed between pre-modern conditions of life and rule and postmodern technology. We might even say that it's possible there is a merciless crushing of the poorest in modernisation projects if they're detached from a human-sized, human-paced focus on the well-being of the ones required to make the modernisation happen, the workers and the families of the workers. Forces of globalisation have had a disproportionately negative effect on the provision of welfare in society, simply because political nation-states formed in the 18th and 19th centuries are no longer able to regulate and control the international market forces that have fundamental effects on the way societies develop. Huge economic pressures on nation-states mean that social welfare systems are under unprecedented pressure. You'll know this from your own experience, of course, but a clear example in the UK is the 15-minute visit for personal care. A woman I know who uses a wheelchair and who is determined to live independently was unable to leave her flat for 4 days because the fob she wears around her neck that opens her own front door broke, and the company under pressure couldn't get a replacement to her. She's often late for appointments because a carer is rushing or late or doesn't come at all. And the care assistants themselves are caught, constrained by tight budgets and overwhelming caseloads. Merciful individuals might ameliorate what is evidently has a system with qualities of mercilessness about it, with no time to spare. And the danger is that the individual merciful action can inadvertently perpetuate, or at least doesn't challenge, the injustice itself. Metz again comments on this. What faith in God's mercy is not to become is a means of withdrawal, so that it might be said against fellow believers, you were no help to me in my history, which was interwoven with yours. You confirmed me in that from which you ought to have kept me. I've been involved recently with a possible creative project run by the theatre company that set up the pop-up theatre in the jungle camp in Calais. They're thinking of travelling from Damascus in Syria to London, carrying a huge symbolic Syrian girl puppet, making the journey that so many Syrians have had to make. Some very serious theatre producers are involved in this advocacy project. The recent incursion by Turkey has relit the fires of hell in that beautiful country, which I visited last year. And so I'm sure this project, if it happens, will all be delayed. But what was interesting was that this group of artists wanted to travel in such a way that they threw themselves on the mercy of the communities through which they travelled, in terms of accommodation, in terms of welcome or not, and shine a light on the vulnerability inherent in this kind of forced travel, not knowing what's ahead of you at any point. The Afghan writer Gurwani Pasali, who arrived in the UK under the bottom of a truck, and who is now a passionate and articulate advocate for a merciful asylum system, is incredibly eloquent about the kindness of strangers on whose mercy his life depended, as he made his way over the course of a year away from danger when he was just 14. The notion that the operation of mercy needs time is one that the Christian spiritual practice of travel in pilgrimage illustrates well. In former centuries, when pilgrims made their way to Rome or Jerusalem or Santiago de Compostela, they would have followed an itinerary, a story written or told by people who'd been that way before, sharing their knowledge and directing their way. Now, we have a more spatial understanding of the journey. When I travelled the Camino a few years ago, I followed a map from above to find the way. Perhaps in this difference of navigation, we lose something more of our need for mercy from strangers on our journey, relying not on others, but on ourselves and our own skill. What might a recovery of mercy look like in the culture of society and church? rooted in our observations yesterday about mercy in the spirituality and lived experience of the individual, which focus on culpability, I guess that a more collective societal expression of mercy will be more practically focused on the relief of suffering and how to increase that relief. I mentioned yesterday that in his commentary on the Lord's Prayer, Karl Barth named what he called lordless powers. His reflection on these was in the context of the petition, "Thy kingdom come," contrasting, as the Gospel of Luke does so often, the oppression evident in the worldly kingdom with the mercy and hope of God's kingdom. Not returning to a pre-modern demonology, but describing these lordless powers as human abilities exalting themselves as lordless forces. They derive power over humans because of the disintegration of their relationship to God. For Karl Barth, the lordless powers were concepts such as the myth of the state, money as a symbol, and ideology. But this description of human abilities exalting themselves as lordless forces rang true as I tried to think about the operation of mercy in society and whether it was possible or even desirable in today's world. The lordless powers of our own society could be described as those that overrun our psyches, dominate our political conversations, and direct and rule our hearts. They're immensely powerful, almost irresistible, especially when not named. And in the meditation I'm suggesting on the power they wield have a possible particular relevance in the operation of mercy in contemporary life. Last week I took part in a day conference looking at the topic of civil rights in society, competing rights sometimes, and in my case, the clash between religious rights on the one hand and secular rights on the other. Out of this day came the following journalistic reflection written by the journalist who'd organised it. Our society has become more complex, creating more points of abrasion, because digital technology has driven us deeper into our echo chambers, and it's made possible an ugly culture of anonymised abuse. And because interacting more and more by digital device rather than face-to-face, we're forgetting the art of social negotiation and trust building. My suggestion is, from this journalistic assessment of where we are, that the habitual stance of Christianity could be, unlike in the past, a mission to coerce and build Christendom by conversion, but now to invite, to persuade, always respecting, and more than that, amplifying the freedom of others to say no. And by example, to create communities that come together with a sense of exploration and adventure, knowing that God's mercy is infinite and ours can find some echo of this day to day. Again, wanting to try to keep this discussion grounded, I want to reflect briefly on two aspects of society and culture that might offer some themes that pertain to our search for mercy in contemporary society and our thoughts about possibly promoting a merciful culture. There are two contemporary areas where I see every day in ministry the themes that pertain to mercy and the promotion of a merciful culture. The first is the area of immigration and asylum, and the second is what has sometimes been called the Wild West of the internet. The first is rooted in pastoral ministry, the second simply as an observer of what happens online. And of course, any discussion of this topic can't possibly ignore the terrible tragedy of 39 people dying in a lorry this week in Essex, and the catastrophe this will have brought on those who love them. The congregation I serve has within it a significant number of men and women who are seeking asylum in the UK on the basis of their sexuality, coming from, for example, Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, and other nations. they find themselves to be what I discern to be peculiarly and distinctly vulnerable. Having hidden their sexuality sometimes for many years in their birth country, suddenly what was forbidden becomes in an instant compulsory. There is no time to adjust. They must declare their sexuality as soon as they arrive, otherwise their claim is challenged as at best disingenuous and at worst fraudulent. This has bearing for me on the operation of time and its relation to, on the operation of mercy and its relation to the passage of time. Pressure of numbers, a stretched system and staff with overflowing caseloads mean that the operation of mercy, which needs time to make good judgments, and also might recognise that human sexual identity is a delicate, nuanced, and sometimes confusing thing, is impossible. Individuals who on their own might want to show sympathy and compassion, even in the way that the questions are asked, don't have the time and space to feel it, let alone to act upon it, with of course notable exceptions. My observation is, in accompanying people through this system, is that both interrogator and interrogated are caught in a sort of dance macabre. The power imbalance is acute. The man or woman seeking asylum is very far from home, exposed personally, and isolated. The interrogator is under time pressure and pressure of numbers. Their personal encounter in a room is in a much wider context, fueled by fears and assumptions that any of us might recognise. Fear of the other, mistrust of strangers, confusion about a fast-moving conversation about gender and sexual identity that might seem bewildering, worry about rapidly changing communities. But when amplified by public discourse, these understandable worries and views that must find some kind of voice can become something like those lordless powers that direct an exchange that can become merciless and dehumanizing of very vulnerable people. When unchecked or amplified, these lordless powers can overrun our human capacity for imaginative compassion, of which every person, right or left, poor or rich, is capable. The insistence from Jesus that I was a stranger and you welcomed me was of course not intended to be a comprehensive guide for public policy. Of course, politically, the movement of people, migration, emigration, immigration, need political regulation. But how to deal with a lesbian African woman who was a sex worker, who was attacked while working, who becomes pregnant, and who comes to see a priest, trembling, exhausted, and with an oversized coat on, hiding her pregnancy, expecting the priest to expel her from the church. Instead, the priest baptizes the child when the time comes, and godparents are found from within the congregation. A fresh claim for asylum is made with support, and although life is very hard, there's something like an urban village helping to give the child and the mother at least sometimes an atmosphere of love. A young Ghanaian man speaks quietly and with dignity about the shame he feels having to answer the question over and over again, are you lying? He longs to fall in love, and he's seen a man that he likes. But because these are delicate matters of the heart, not yet of the body for him, he can't provide the officials with physical evidence that he's gay, which they won't believe him without. I spent some time recently with a man who survives in the city by being paid for sex sometimes. He can make decent money in a day, but if he does do a day of this, working from a rented flat advertised on a website, then he needs time to recover afterwards. In some ways he feels lost, used, addicted, although never to drugs. It becomes apparent that he, also being by birth a Muslim, his vulnerability economically and socially is of a similar level, in my view, to the widow described in Jesus' parable when she persistently asks for justice from the man Luke describes as the unjust judge. I was incredibly moved by the kindness and humour of this man, and heard in his conversation his persistence in wanting to make something of his life, trying to find someone to love, his persistence in wanting to connect and make friends, and wanting to help other people. From deep within his very precarious circumstances, I met someone who was indescribably alive. I heard in his conversation a persistent voice that would not be silenced or put down. And in his kind eyes, I learned something about what it might be like to pray persistently for mercy like that widow. I experienced my time with him as a merciful assessment of my own life, light years away from his in terms of agency and power, but with his humour and gentleness much more likely to invite me to change and to keep in touch with him and maybe help him change too. From a pastoral perspective, the area of asylum draws out an important difference in terms of the operation of mercy that I've alluded to before, and I want to mention again. God's mercy, evident in Christ's death and resurrection, operated as if vulnerability weren't dangerous. But while we're asked to echo that as Christ's disciples, we're not asked to indulge our Messiah complexes and seek crucifixion for ourselves. Therefore, the mercy that human beings are called to is not a forced begging for mercy, but a redeemed mercy, as I mentioned before, freely chosen and given. But begging for mercy is something I've witnessed much more frequently now that I'm involved with people seeking asylum on the basis of their sexuality. All that was forbidden to them becomes in an instant almost compulsory if they're to survive. They often feel they have no choice but to beg for mercy within a system that of course must have its questions and regulations, but is, in my observation, struggling to remain humane. God's mercy operates as if vulnerability weren't dangerous. But of course it is dangerous. And there's the difference between the mercy of God and the mercy that we're called to, of which we're capable. The second area of contemporary discourse that I've reflected on is the relatively new world of online. And here, some of the same themes might start to appear of the crossing of borders into foreign lands. Because of my own generation, however proficient I become online, I'm always going to be a digital immigrant, not a digital native, like those who've grown up online. Here, perhaps, are different lordless powers, to which I find myself unwillingly and sometimes addictively subject. The lordless power of greed for experience, diversion, likes and affirmation. The lordless power of desire for action without consequence, for an unfettered freedom to use language unanchored in the real-world constraints of decency, libel, or reciprocity. The lordless power of addiction to distraction, displacement activity, and sensation. But before I start to sound merciless myself, of course, huge amounts of good and creative connectivity is celebrated and made possible online. And I don't want to fall into an unthinking cliche that just sets out to bash social media. Amazing connections are made, and sometimes lives are saved. But as we consider and start to navigate this new online world, we remember that it's one of the fundamental assumptions of Christian teaching that the world is not finished, and it's idolatrous of us to believe that we can make it perfect ourselves. And so there will always be new forms of poverty, new privations, new injustices to which the operation of mercy must be applied. And poverty online is often couched in terms of real-world isolation, chasing the illusion of autonomy, indulging a need for anonymity. Online access might in large part be free or inexpensive, but a poverty of spirit once you're there is as damaging as it is in real life. I read recently of a new kind of conversation that's happening, especially between what are known as influencers. Often young people who film themselves giving, for example, a makeup tutorial on YouTube or singing a song that they've written, start to acquire Instagram followers, develop their brand, and then sell their ability to tweet or retweet certain products or services. The new conversation has resonated to me as one that, even though it doesn't name mercy, has a merciful quality about it. And I cite it precisely because there is so much to be cross about in a world of trolls and bots and algorithms, that new forms of mercy are as important to find as the opposite. One of the issues for influencers is about what authenticity looks like online. Either an influencer is attacked for being fake. For example, one was caught out using the same cloud formation in pictures of herself in a bikini in completely different countries. Another for being fake, for not disclosing that she's being paid for an Instagram post with product placements. Academics have commented both on the highly curated aesthetic of social media posts and on the gendered aspect to the reaction. Young women are getting vicious backlashes online to an even greater extent than male influencers. Tabby Gevinson is 23. She has 515,000 followers on Instagram and 371,000 Twitter followers. I don't know how many of those are the same people. For all of my years growing up online, she says, I'm still unable to both rapidly and accurately manage so many realities at once, to account for hundreds of people's feedback in a matter of minutes. This cycle of judging and being judged is a black hole into which time disappears, in which I and the people I encounter are all frozen in our profiles, and where I still judge people I don't know for reasons I can't even remember. I think I am a writer and an actor and an artist, but I haven't believed the purity of my own intentions ever since I became my own salesperson too. Another influencer, Tiffany Mitchell, who has 215,000 Instagram followers, doesn't plan to stop posting anytime soon. I'm more determined than ever to stay telling the truth and being vulnerable about things, she says, of her Instagram presence. It's sad to me that people are just so drowned in way too much information and clickbait journalism and are so willing to believe the absolute worst. I think vulnerability is the only way to shift that. I'm weirded out by the amount of hatred that I realise exists, but it's not going to stop me. I find these two young women to be very wise. All the themes are there: judgment, vulnerability, the passage of time, and the frozen identities without what we talked about yesterday as a merciful fluidity and ability to change. The judgment is voracious, the vulnerability certainly dangerous, the passage of time often more confusing than clarifying. I want to listen to the reflections of these 20-somethings because their assessment of the online culture they experience strikes me as helpful in writing the laws of that new world, where new injustices and new poverties will undoubtedly develop. They, by suffering the challenges that they have, are drawing up an agenda for change that only they can promote to their followers. And it's a search for a different kind of authenticity that I hear anyway as a search for some kind of mercy. The Christian contribution of mercy, as I've been attempting to outline, rests on a recovery of the importance of dignity of the individual, and then solidarity, and then a search for justice, especially in the light of what turns out to be an environment where our merciless judgment of ourselves and others online can be given free rein. Mercy and its companion truth are not sentimental individualistic notions only, but are societal values, and the way we talk about them together is important. If, as Christian theology wants to say, human dignity is universal, based on the doctrine of creation, therefore solidarity and a concern for justice is a natural development from that fundamental belief in human dignity. Mercy becomes a cultural concern as well as a spiritual one. And if the Church can find language to speak of the divine mercy on which it depends, then it has more chance of letting it infuse the institutions of society now and doing that task of interpretation. As Christians, if the Church accepts that mercy is at the core of the divine nature and at the heart of the ministry of Jesus, then living close to the story of Jesus in the world today will call the Church to be a merciful place, even as it grows and invites others to join. In St. Bede's commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, he noted that Jesus' call to Matthew was, as he put it, miserando atque eligendo, by having mercy and choosing him. The call to discipleship and the exercise of mercy were one and the same thing. Some of you will know that Pope Francis has chosen this as his motto, by having mercy and choosing him. Perhaps Bede's intention is to make sure we focus and understand the close connection between the act of mercy and our will. For Jesus, choosing Matthew and having mercy towards him were the same thing. And perhaps that's why the distinctive and unique activity of the Church, its liturgy, has to be at the heart of the consideration of mercy. Kyrie eleison, we repeat, said or sung every time. If the mercy of God is a horizon toward which we travel, then the Eucharist, rather than being primarily a memorial service, becomes a future-orientated sacrament, sharing the bread of salvation and the wine of the kingdom, expecting that the culture of that kingdom is both merciful and truthful. It's a culture where all are welcome and all are fed, where the gifts of creation, the grain once scattered in the fields, are cherished, and our interdependence with all that lives is emphasised. It's the proclamation of the mercy at the heart of the gospel that then infuses the life of the Church and outlines the prophetic work of which it's capable, rehearsed every time the Eucharist is celebrated. My sense is that in a siloed and divided society, a consideration of what a merciful culture might look like seems like a conversation worth having. The reality is that when we human beings encounter someone who is truly other from us, we often want to do a number of things. Co-opt, that is, pretend they're not different anyway. Coerce, force them to be more like us. Colonise, dominate until our differences are much less visible. It's one of the greatest challenges of our time to let the other remain different from us, but find a way to be at peace. I want to suggest that tolerance is not enough. Christianity certainly can't claim to have all the answers, but in common with other world religions, its focus on mercy means that the Church may have something distinctive to contribute about the quality of reconciliation necessary to build not just a tolerant society, but a just and a peaceful one. And so a final word about language. I was privileged to be responsible for the liturgy to end UK operations in Iraq at St Paul's Cathedral in 2009. Such a conflicted war, now as then. At that service, the then Archbishop Rowan Williams said this: "When we as Christians consider the sacrifice that purchased peace and mercy for the whole world, we think not only of the death of Jesus on the cross, but also of the cost of love and openness to the stranger that marked his entire life. We can recognise the same thing at work in a lesser degree in any life that is dedicated to taking the world a little further out of barbarity and violence. Many people of my generation and younger grew up doubting whether we should ever see another straightforward international conflict fought by a standing army with conventional weapons. We had begun to forget the realities of cost. And when such conflict appeared on the horizon, there were those among policymakers and commentators who were able to talk about it without really measuring the price, the cost of justice. Perhaps we have learned something, if only that there is a time to keep silence, a time to let go of the satisfyingly overblown language that is so tempting for human beings. Language matters, and how we speak and what we say is in itself, like Jesus' call to Matthew, a speech act that in our mouths can help to encourage or destroy, to build up or tear down. And in Christianity, symbolic language is important. Wood can mean suffering. Blood can cleanse. Judgment is a refining fire. You are the light of the world. In Scripture, mercy is rain or dew, and as dew is new every morning, and as Shakespeare quoted, it drops from heaven. And so I want to close my few thoughts on mercy with a reflection by Thomas Merton, who in the middle of the most violent 20th century wrote this from the solitude of his Trappist monastery. The night became very dark. The rain surrounded the whole cabin with its virginal myth, a whole world of meaning, of secrecy, of silence, of rumour. Think of it. All that speech pouring down, selling nothing, judging nobody, drenching the thick mulch of dead leaves, soaking the trees, filling the gullies and crannies of the wood with water, washing out to places where men have stripped the hillside. What a thing it is to sit absolutely alone in the forest at night, cherished by this wonderful, unintelligible, perfectly innocent speech, the most comforting speech in the world, the talk that rain makes by itself.
Lucy, thank you. Questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. I am a devoutly heretical Quaker deist, and I wonder if the church in Piccadilly is the one just over the road from the premises of the Royal Astronomical Society. I can always get a discussion going with my colleagues if I accuse them of being unscientific atheists. I'd like to make 3 ultra-brief suggestions for you to comment on if you wish. 2 of them are Quaker sayings. The first is that the Creator has no other hands but ours. The second, that we all have to choose between the love of power and the power of love. And the third's my own, a little longer. And it is this, that fighting's exciting, but love lasts longer. The operation of the neurotransmitters of adrenaline and oxytocin are radically different. And that is why all too often power triumphs over love in the short run. But in the long run, mercy, love, and forgiveness, three sides of the same triangle, lead to the avoidance or resolution of conflict. And that is thermodynamically efficient. And my research on cosmology tells me that the Creator's cosmos is on our side.
Do you want to respond, or shall we see another question?
I think it was brilliant. Except to say that a number of the people who come to St James's quite often on a Sunday morning describe themselves as Quanglicans. Quanglicans. So they come to us for a bit of hymn singing and mostly go to the Quakers.
Yes, Mia. A microphone will come to you.
Thank you. I don't know how intelligent this question is, so have mercy on me. The quality of mercy is strained. We're taught and take an active part in the divine mercy, the abundance of the ever-forgiving God, etc. Is the quantity of mercy strained? The parable of the prodigal son that you spoke about yesterday, the father figure who was looking outside the whole time, every day, for his son to return, etc., and to have that abundant, limitless, infinite mercy has an effect on other people who are going about, I don't know, the farm work or whatever it is, or the servants in the house. When we are called to give that full, abundant mercy, other things can suffer. And I'm just wondering whether the quantity, you spoke about time limits and parameters and constraints. No, this is really about the lecture yesterday, but I wanted to hear all of it. How do we get that balance whilst we're still operating in divine light?
I think probably tonight I made a bit more, I mean it came up in the questions yesterday, I made a bit more differentiation between divine mercy and the mercy of which we're capable, really by saying, just by saying the phrase that God in Christ, that mercy acted as if vulnerability weren't dangerous, but it is dangerous for us. So that's why I think I want to really properly develop a distinction between the imitation and the echo that we can be capable of in terms of our open operation of mercy and divine mercy, because otherwise we get caught up in we're never going to be able to do it and it's foolish and it's too much. So I think the Father in that story, it's often preached as that's what God's forgiveness and God's mercy is like. It could be that Jesus is saying something slightly different about a family and the dynamics within a family and how the older son operates as much as how the younger son operates. But if we do take that to be an indication of how God's mercy operates, then ours will always be a recognition of our own agency and our own power, going back to your point, so about the power of love and the love of power, that we will be able to operate mercy from our own agency, but it will never be, it can't be as outrageous, I suppose, as the mercy of God. The difficulty we have in talking about mercy is that, and it came up a little bit yesterday in the questions, is that we kind of think, well, that's not on, it's not fair. People's behaviour won't change without punishment and limit and all that kind of thing, because we know what we're like. But I think I was trying to say yesterday that God's mercy, because God is so utterly other from us, that's one of the theological bits of work we have to do before we start saying that we damagingly preach mercy to one another in ways that actually that damages our own sense of self. So I think I am trying to now pull away from saying there's divine mercy there and there's the human mercy of which we're capable. But the operation of time in human mercy is very, very important. There was a very interesting study done some years ago of a group of ordinands. This is in America, and they were all told to come to a room in a hospital, and they were then told to go quickly to another lecture at the other end of the hospital. And one group was told to hurry, and they had to get there immediately. The other group was told they had an hour or two. And they all went past the same person in distress on a corridor. Not one of the people in a hurry stopped. And they were just trying to help these ordinands understand that, the parable of the Good Samaritan is the busy priest who runs past. And thankfully, we've got people in L'Arche who wash our faces as well. But, that drivenness and that I must do this rather than that, it mitigates our own ability to operate mercy. God doesn't have that constraint of time, of course.
Thank you for another mind-blowing embarrassment of riches, and I was very moved by your sharing those individual lived experiences of those seeking asylum because of their sexual identity. And you acknowledged the need for regulation and system, but were maybe over-merciful yourself in calling the system struggling to remain humane. The creation of a hostile environment seems to be not struggling to be humane, but a deliberate policy of inhumanity. And you've been passionate of making mercy and truth societal values. So how do we influence that system or change that system? It's an impossible question I'm asking you, to make sure that the policy of mercy is not struggling in that system.
You're right, it's an impossible question. At the same time, I do want to be really careful here, because I think that the pace of development and the pace of change for nation states, and I use the Brazil example just because that was a particular example used by that theologian, but the pace of change falls more sharply on the poorest, it always does. And so I do want to be careful, not necessarily saying that one particular policy is any more iniquitous than the underlying pace, which I think is more powerful. And if I'm speaking in the defence, I'm never going to speak in defence of a hostile environment ever, but it was couched as a hostile environment for illegal immigration, not for all immigrants. And the difficulty was, I think, and is, that it just became the environment for the entire asylum system. And that's the problem with setting up something like that. I suppose I just wonder what a system would look like that had mercy as one of the objectives built into it. I mean, I was chair of governors at a school for 10 years, and we spent a long time talking about what kind of learners we wanted to have in this school, and what was the relationship between exam results and the quality of the ethos of the school. And it's a really interesting challenge, it's like a wash that's put over a whole system. If you say, how could we deliberately look at ways of making this system more merciful? To my mind, I've got one idea about it, which would be that the way that the time is spent is the wrong way around right now. So at the moment, I'm talking particularly about people claiming asylum on the basis of their sexuality. As I said, everything that's forbidden becomes in a moment compulsory, and if they don't say it, then it's very difficult. So what I would do is slow the process down at the beginning, but speed up the decision at the end. Because what we are also dealing with are a number of people who have they're in limbo, they're stateless almost, not able to work because the appeal system doesn't allow people to work, not able to claim benefits, and there's arguments about that, but they're actually properly stuck with no recourse to public funds for a very, very long time. So that seems to be the merciful, timeliness of a judgment seems to be that needs to be speeded up. but the beginning part could be slowed down. And perhaps if you had mercy or something like mercy as an objective in a system, you might end up with a system that operated in that way. But there's not a lot of sign of that. You're right.
I'm aware of a number of hands going up. Andy?
Thank you so much for your lectures, Lucy. Just reflecting on yesterday's and today's lectures, I cannot help but think that between the tension between human and divine agencies, there are always bystanders. And the word kept coming back to me.
Bystanders.
Bystanders. Okay. And not all bystanders are innocent. There are some less innocent. And I'm just thinking whether what choices are open, are left for bystanders, ethical or otherwise.
I know you just, sorry to make it clear, you're saying that we are necessarily bystanders.
I think a lot of us are caught.
A lot of us are caught as bystanders. I mean, just going back to what I said about Gillian Rose's comment yesterday, where she was really trying to challenge us as bystanders and say that we need... Oh. I'm so sorry. Here we are again. I lost my thread, of course. That she challenged us to say that we needed to, as bystanders, let go of what she called our illusion of uninvolved innocence. So that's very hard to live with, though. How can I live with the kind of conviction or culpability appropriately without it overwhelming me? And that's where I think a recourse to divine mercy has to be. It's probably our own, within the Christian framework, it's probably our only saving grace, because we're not responsible for everything. But we're also not, as I mentioned yesterday, shuffling, saying, I can't think of anything to be sorry for if I repent of my sin. We're neither of those things. And we tend to, because both of those are places of refuge, I think it's very difficult to have a kind of balanced and proper sense of what our agency is. I suppose all I can offer is to say that I think we usually underplay it. Usually. I think that's as far as I could probably go, because there isn't a kind of big answer. There's all kinds of ways in which, political parties are one, broad-based community organising is others. There's lots of different ways in which change can be affected by people in different groups. But I think if I'm talking theologically, then our presumption has to be that we're probably assuming we've got less power than we have, and we're probably assuming that divine mercy is less merciful than it is. And so we just start to take baby steps, really, into living with our identity as bystanders. Which, I suppose the last thing I say about that, which is, I've tried to say that I think our identities must be fluid. So we're not always bystanders. We're sometimes protagonists, we're sometimes victims, we're sometimes perpetrators. But to try to understand that and release ourselves from being perpetually fixed. That's why those young women really interested me. They said, we get stuck in these identities, and I'm still judging a person online, and I can't even remember what I'm judging them for, but I've got them set there. I think that's a very wise thing to say, which I want to listen to, I suppose.
Final question, gentleman up here, or final public question.
Thanks, Lucy. I wondered whether you consider enough attention has been given to the value of fairness over a number of years, and this city was one city that had a fairness commission, and I think there's been about 10 of these, because in a sense fairness is about the process of decision making. It's not about the outcome. And north of the border, you recognise my Scotland accent, the government has actually produced for all professions across the board, asking them to think about the fairness duty. Now that word, that concept, doesn't apply in England, although one or two measures have been tried in the Equalities Act to include the notion of fairness. How would you place that from your own perspective?
probably by restating really the difference between divine mercy and human mercy, because divine mercy looks unfair quite often to us. The parable of the workers in the vineyard, the ones who get paid the same at the end as at the beginning. Sometimes the stories that Jesus is telling, because of the kind of profligate and outrageous nature of God's love and mercy, feels unfair to us. So I think fairness is incredibly important concept within which probably mercy could operate. But I think that in that case I would draw a distinction. And we sometimes just have to sit and think, sit and listen to those stories and think, really, is that really how I'm supposed to act? You can't imagine doing that. And it looks like the other person's got off scot-free, this. I think that's God's business. And you have to leave that to God. Our operation of mercy will necessarily have more limits than that. And I think fairness is incredibly helpful ingredient to put into this. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. This should be a long and eloquent speech of thanks, but they'd rather listen to you than listen to me. So the brevity is in order to allow for that. I shall certainly take away this phrase, redeemed, not weaponised mercy, and those marvellous vignettes that you have brought to us of the homeless sleeping beside the Ritz Hotel, while also having a relationship with those who manage the Ritz Hotel. These asylum seekers who are moving from not being able to tell to having to tell, as just a couple of wonderful examples. And as a much older digital immigrant, I think perhaps that the brief way of dealing with this would be to say, love. Thank you very much indeed.